Okay, so let's talk about public key cryptography today. So our main topic is today's main topic is asymmetric encryptions and digital signature. And then let's just first talk about symmetric encryption first, right? Asymmetric encryption first, right? The symmetric encryption, right? It's what is really unique about symmetric encryption is that it has a public key and private key. So the public key, right, is known as, like, as name indicate, actually it's public, right? The public, as the name indicates, it can be made public. So you can include your public key at the bottom of your email or post it online, or maybe you can put your public key on your business card, right? So basically the idea is what anyone can have access to your public key. So that's the idea. That's the idea, right? And so that's why it's called a public key. And there is a corresponding private key. So when you have a public key, right, you should also have a corresponding private key, right? So that's why it's called a key pair, right? And the private key, as the name indicates, right, you have to keep it secret. So it must be kept secret, and you cannot share your private key with anyone else, right? So your private key, you have to hide it in a very safe place. And that's why it's called a private key. Okay? So let's talk about this a little bit. So as you can see, right? As you can see, this is how you can think. Oops. Okay. So let's just undo. Okay. So basically, you have what? Alice, right? You have Alice, and then you have a Bob. Okay. In the symmetric case, right? In the symmetric encryption algorithms, you know that Alice and Bob, they share a one key. Right? They use only one key, which is called what? Which is called a shared key. Or sometimes it's called symmetric key, right? Symmetric key. And then also it is called what? Secret key. Right? So they use Alice, if Alice wants to send this plain text message, right? So Alice uses the shared key to encrypt this message, right? And then send it to Bob. So what Alice does is he creates a ciphertext, right? And then encryption algorithm. So he uses encrypt E, right? E for the encrypt, sorry, E. Encrypt, read message, right? Read what? With the shared key. And then Bob also use what? The same shared key, right? And decrypt that ciphertext C, right? So decrypt ciphertext with the same shared key. And then you can get what? You can get this text message in the plain text message, right? So that's a symmetric key case. But for the asymmetric key, right? Asymmetric key, basically, the idea is you can think this, let's say you have a shared key, right? I mean, this is just my illustration, okay? So what people, the problem with the symmetric encryption is, you know that it's sharing this key, right? Over the untrusted network, such as internet, is not easy, right? like sharing, like how you can, like for example, distribute this shared key to the, let's say to the receiver, in this example to Bob, is not an easy task, right? Especially over an untrusted network such as the internet. So what people does in 1970s, right? The scientists, actually the mathematicians, right? They came up with the algorithm called asymmetric encryptions. Now, conceptually, what they did is they split this key, right? They split this key into a something called a public key, and then the private key. So instead of a one key, they split this into a two keys. One is called public key, and another one is called a private key. It has to be like a dual. It's corresponding private key. So the idea is the Alice, right? It's every individual, right, or every entity has a if they want to use a symmetric key encryption algorithms, they must have a key pair, the public key and private key pair. For example, in Alice case, right? In Alice, the Alice has, of course, public key, and then corresponding what? Private key. And the Bob, of course, has what? His own public key, and it's his own private key. So when you're talking about a private key and public key, you must specify who owns this key pair, right? So this is owned by Alice, and this public key and private key pair is owned by Bob, right? And of course, this is Bob's private key, and this is Bob's public key. So you have to say Bob's private key and Bob's public key, and this is Bob's public key. I mean the Alice public key and Alice private key. Okay, so you have to say that this key is belong to, for example, Alice, and this key pair belongs to Bob. Okay, so that's the idea. So this is asymmetric algorithms, right? Asymmetric key, right? Okay, so that's the main difference between a symmetric key and asymmetric encryptions, right? And so, and now the notations. Okay, let's talk about notation. And when the public key is used, so typically public key is used to encrypt a plain text message M with Alice public key. Like this is an example. If Alice wants to send an encrypted message, she has to use her public key to encrypt. And note that, so they're using this, so I want you to know that they use what? So whenever you use this curly bracket, right? And then you have to say whether it's Alice or Bob. So whenever you use this curly bracket, that means what? That means the public key is used. So in this example, right? Whatever the content is, could be M or whatever, right? It's the contents, whatever, right? And then when you say Alice, then this thing, right? We'll call it M in this example. This plain text message M is encrypted with Alice what? Public key. So that's the whole thing. This whole thing is basically the ciphertext. This becomes ciphertext, right? And then so that's why this whole thing, right, becomes a ciphertext C, Or if you want to be more specific, you can say C and subscript Alice, meaning that the ciphertext is created by Alice. So we can say ciphertext is M Alice, right? This is basically this is ciphertext. And then, or we just simply C ciphertext Alice, right? Meaning that the ciphertext is created by Alice is this notation M, right? And when there's a private key is used, when the private key is used, there are two different cases. Decrypt the ciphertext C with Alice private key. So whenever you use this square bracket, right? And then when you put some name, either Alice or Bob, that means the private key is used. So this, since you use the square bracket, this means what? Alice what? Alice private key. So whenever you use the curly bracket, right? Curly bracket, this means what? Alice public key. Okay, so the signing the message, also the private key also used for signing. So we'll talk about this later, right? And then, but first, let's just focus on the first case, case number 1. The private key is used to actually decrypt the ciphertext usually, and they use this square bracket notations, right? So the example is this, right? And then what it really means is this. So you have, okay, so you have what? You have a message M, right? And then the Alice wants to encrypt this message, right? Encrypt this message with Alice public key. So that's what that means. Because this square bracket is used, this means Alice public key is used, right? Oops, I have to use a different, I'll just use a black. So the Alice public key is used, right? So this is Alice public key. And then, so this whole thing is a ciphertext, right? This whole thing is a ciphertext. And then this square bracket, so whenever you use a square bracket, that means what? Private key, right? So when I put Alice, so this whole thing, right? This whole thing, basically Alice private key is applied to this whole thing. And then basically this cancels out. This cancels out, as you can see. And then you got plain text M. You know this M square bracket Alice, you know that this is a ciphertext, right? Basically, if you just rewrite this, you can say C, right? Because this is a ciphertext, and Alice. And then you can get the M, right? Because if I just rewrite this, I can rewrite this like this. Assuming that C is what? M Alice. Okay, so this is the notations. Okay, and okay, so this is the notation for the public and private notation. The second case, the signing the message, and actually it's related to this. The signing is related to this. I'll talk more about this later. Okay. Thank you. So let me just stop recording this lecture.